She was a brilliant physicist. He was a powerful school board president. Their chemistry? Explosive. Dr. Evelyn Hart had spent years perfecting her time-stutter device, a tool that allowed her to freeze time and play her own dangerous games. And Charles Winters? He was her favorite challenge, a man of control, now completely at her mercy, or so she thought. Until the day he looked her in the eyes and whispered, "It doesn't work on me." Now, Evelyn's secret is out, but Charles has one of his own. He's immune to her powers, and he's been playing his own game all along. But before she can figure out the rules, a third player enters the mix. James Anderson. Mysterious, dangerous, and, somehow, even more powerful than she ever imagined. Now, trapped between two men who hold secrets as dark as her own, Evelyn must decide. Who can she trust? Who is really in control? And how far is she willing to go to win? One thing is certain. This game has no reset button. Stay with us to find out how this twisted battle for power ends. And don't forget to subscribe. Do you feel that? Dr. Evelyn Hart whispered, her breath warm against the shell of his ear. Her fingers trailed down the lapel of his tailored suit, the fabric smooth beneath her touch. A ripple in the air? Charles Winters, school board president and the most composed man in the room, froze mid-sentence. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The PTA meeting around them, a sea of bored faces and droning voices, stilled like a photograph. Evelyn smirked, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Time-stutter device, she thought proudly, adjusting the slim silver bracelet on her wrist. It had taken her months of clandestine tinkering in her lab, but this was worth every late night. She'd freeze time, just for a moment, long enough to indulge in her own little games. And Charles? He was her favorite plaything. She circled him slowly, her heels clicking against the tile floor in the otherwise silent room. His tie was perfectly knotted, his posture rigid even in stasis. Evelyn tilted her head, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "You're always so controlled," she murmured, her fingers undoing the top button of his shirt. "But what happens when I take that control away?" She leaned in, her lips brushing against his neck, and pressed the button on her bracelet. Time resumed with a soft hum, and Charles blinked, his words faltering. As I was saying, the budget for the new gymnasium." His hand instinctively went to his collar, his brow furrowing. "Is it warm in here?" Evelyn stepped back, her expression innocent. "It does feel a bit stuffy," she agreed, her voice sweet as honey. She crossed her arms, letting her nails graze her own skin as she watched him fumble. He always looks so deliciously confused, she thought. But something was different this time. Charles's gaze lingered on her, sharp and calculating, as if he were piecing together a puzzle. Evelyn's pulse quickened. No, she thought. He couldn't possibly. It all started 3 months ago, at the first PTA meeting of the school year. Evelyn had been bored out of her mind, sitting in the back row with her legs crossed and her phone buzzing with unanswered lab notifications. The topic? Budget allocations for school supplies. Riveting. She'd been tinkering with her prototype, a device capable of creating micropauses in the flow of time, when something unexpected happened. The room around her froze. The principal's mouth hung open mid-word, the coffee in Mrs. Thompson's cup suspended mid-pour. Evelyn had stared, her heart racing, as she realized what she'd done. She'd only meant to test it in a controlled environment, but, well, curiosity got the better of her. She'd walked up to Charles, who was mid-gesture, his hand frozen in the air, and studied him. He was handsome, in a severe, buttoned-up kind of way. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that could cut glass. And his eyes, always so serious, so untouchable. Evelyn had leaned in, her lips close enough to feel the warmth of his skin, and whispered, "What would you do if I kissed you right now?" She'd pressed the button, and time resumed. Charles had hesitated, his hand lowering to his side, his brow furrowing as if he'd felt a phantom touch. That was the moment Evelyn became addicted. Now, in the present, Charles was staring at her like he knew her secret. Evelyn's lips curved into a coy smile as she slid into the seat beside him. "You seem distracted, Charles," she said, her voice low. "Something on your mind?" His gaze flickered to her bracelet, a quick, almost imperceptible glance, and her stomach twisted. "Just thinking," he said, his tone measured. "About the chess club fundraiser. You're still helping with that, aren't you?" "Of course," she replied, her fingers idly tracing patterns on the table. "Though I'm not sure I'll be much of a match for you. I've heard you're quite the strategist." Charles's lips twitched into a smirk. I like to think I can hold my own. Evelyn leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his. Care to put that to the test? A little friendly competition? His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away. I've always been more interested in the mating game, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Her breath caught. He knows. The chess club fundraiser was held in the school library, its tables rearranged to accommodate the event. Evelyn arrived late, intentionally so, and found Charles already seated at a board, his fingers idly moving a pawn. She approached him, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and took the seat across from him. Ready to lose? She teased, setting her bracelet on the table. Charles's gaze flicked to it, and then back to her. Ready to win, he countered, his tone light but his eyes serious. The game began quietly, their moves deliberate and calculated. Evelyn captured his knight. Charles took her bishop. But as the game progressed, the tension between them grew unbearable. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her every move, every breath. Check, he said, moving his queen into position. Evelyn glanced at the board, then up at him. Is that all you've got? She murmured, her knee brushing his beneath the table. Charles's jaw tightened. Not even close. She pressed the button on her bracelet, and the room froze. The hum of conversation stopped. A child mid-laugh, a teacher mid-sip, everything stilled. Evelyn stood, rounding the table to stand before him. She leaned down, her lips inches from his ear. What if I told you I could do this whenever I wanted? She whispered. What if I told you I've already done it to you? She pressed the button, and Charles blinked, his hand instinctively going to his ear. His gaze locked onto hers, and she saw something in his eyes, acknowledgement. Triumph. Your move, he said, his voice steady. Evelyn's heart raced as she returned to her seat. The game resumed, but now it was different. Every move was charged, every glance a challenge. She captured his queen. He took her rook. And then, as she moved her king to escape his attack, he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. I'm immune, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Your little device, it doesn't work on me anymore. Evelyn's breath hitched. Prove it, she whispered. Charles pressed the button on her bracelet, and the room froze. He stood, circling the table like a predator. You're not the only one who knows how to play games, he said, his hand brushing her cheek. But I prefer to play for keeps. Time resumed, and Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. Checkmate, she said, her voice trembling as she moved her queen into position. Charles smiled, slow and deliberate, and leaned in until his lips were a breath away from hers. Not yet, he murmured, but close. Evelyn's fingers twitched on the edge of the chessboard, the cool wood grounding her as she replayed Charles's words in her head. Not yet, but close. His proximity, his confidence, the way he had frozen time as effortlessly as she did, it all sent a shiver down her spine that she couldn't quite suppress. So, she began, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. If you're immune, who else might be? Charles leaned back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel utterly exposed. That's the question, isn't it? If I've developed immunity, it's possible others have too. And that, he paused, his gaze flicking to her wrist where the time-stutter device rested, could be a problem for you. Evelyn's lips curled into a sly smirk, though her heart was racing. Or, she countered, leaning forward just enough to emphasize the word, it could be an opportunity. Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. An opportunity? To uncover who else might be playing the game, she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. Think about it, Charles. If there are others like you, wouldn't you want to know who they are? What they're capable of? He considered her for a moment, then nodded slowly. And how do you propose we do that? Evelyn's smirk deepened as she reached into her purse, pulling out a sleek, silver device the size of a pen. This, she said, holding it up between them, is a prototype. It's designed to detect disruptions in the time-stutter field. If someone is immune, it'll pick up on it. Charles's eyes narrowed, intrigued. Clever. And you've tested it? Not yet, she admitted, her tone playful. But I thought you might like to be my first test subject. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Always the scientist, Evelyn. All right, I'm in. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. Your way, she echoed, her eyebrow arching in challenge. Yes, he said, his voice firm. We'll start at the next PDA meeting. It's the perfect environment to test your device and to see who else might be immune. Evelyn leaned back, her mind already racing with possibilities. Agreed. But, she added, her tone turning sly, if we're going to be partners in this, I expect you to keep up. Charles's smile turned predatory, and he leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Oh, Evelyn, he murmured, I'll do more than keep up. The words sent a thrill through her, and she had to fight to keep her composure. This, she thought, is going to be fun. The next PTA meeting was bustling with parents, teachers, and administrators, all gathered in the school auditorium. Evelyn stood near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd as she held the silver device discreetly in her hand. Across the room, Charles was deep in conversation with the principal, though his gaze kept flicking to her, a silent reminder of their agreement. She pressed the button on her bracelet, and the room froze. Parents mid-sentence, the principal's arm raised in an animated gesture, even the dust motes hanging in the air, everything stopped. Evelyn moved through the crowd, the device in her hand emitting a soft, steady hum. As she neared Charles, the hum grew louder, confirming his immunity. But it was the faint, almost imperceptible spike in the device's readings as she passed a man near the stage that caught her attention. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Him. A teacher, perhaps? She didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Confident, almost too confident. She moved closer, the device's hum intensifying. Gotcha. Time resumed, and Evelyn slipped back into place, her mind racing. She caught Charles's eye and gave him a subtle nod, signaling that she'd found someone. He excused himself from the principal and made his way over to her, his expression carefully neutral. Well, he asked under his breath. Stage left, she murmured, her eyes flicking toward the man. Tall, dark hair, blue tie. The device picked up on him. Charles followed her gaze, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Interesting. Let's see what he's hiding. As the meeting continued, Evelyn and Charles worked in tandem, each playing their parts perfectly. Charles struck up a conversation with the man, his charm and authority making it easy to draw him in, while Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her sharp mind analyzing every word, every gesture. So, mister? Charles began, extending a hand. Anderson, the man replied, shaking his hand firmly. James Anderson. I'm a substitute teacher here. Ah, James. Charles Winters, school board president. Pleasure to meet you. Likewise, James said, though there was a glint in his eye that Evelyn didn't miss. As the conversation continued, Evelyn's suspicions only grew. There was something off about James, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And then there's the device, she thought, her fingers brushing against the silver pen in her pocket. She stepped forward, joining the conversation with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James, was it? I don't believe we've met. I'm Dr. Evelyn Hart. James turned to her, his gaze lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. Dr. Hart, he said, his voice smooth. A pleasure. Evelyn's smile tightened, but she didn't break eye contact. So, James, what brings you to the PTA meeting? I don't usually see substitutes here. James shrugged, his demeanor relaxed. Just trying to get more involved in the school community. I've always been interested in unique opportunities. The way he emphasized the word made Evelyn's skin prickle. Unique opportunities, she echoed, her tone light but probing. James' smile widened, and for a moment, it felt like they were speaking in code, each word a hidden threat. Exactly. Charles stepped in, his voice calm but firm. Well, James, if you're looking to get involved, I'm sure we can find a place for you. The school always needs dedicated individuals. I'm sure you will, James said, his eyes flicking between Charles and Evelyn. And I'm looking forward to it. As the conversation continued, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being played. James isn't just immune, she realized. He's dangerous. She caught Charles's eye, and he gave her a subtle nod. We need to talk. When the meeting finally ended, Evelyn and Charles excused themselves, slipping into an empty classroom. The moment the door closed behind them, Evelyn turned to Charles, her expression serious. He's not just immune, she said, her voice low. He knows something. I can feel it. Charles nodded, his jaw tight. Agreed. But what? Evelyn paced the room, her mind racing. I don't know. But if he's immune and he's involved with the school, this could be bigger than we thought. Charles stepped closer, his presence grounding her. Then we'll figure it out. Together. She met his gaze, the intensity in his eyes mirroring her own. Together, she repeated, her voice soft but determined. For a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared mission pressing down on them. Then, without warning, Charles closed the distance between them, his lips crashing against hers in a kiss that was as much a challenge as it was a promise. Evelyn responded instantly, her hands gripping his shoulders as she deepened the kiss, her body alight with the electric thrill of their connection. This wasn't just about the game anymore, it was about them, about the undeniable pull between two people who thrived on control, on the edge of danger. When they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, Charles's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, his voice rough with desire. "But first—" Evelyn's smirk returned, her eyes glinting with anticipation. "Let the games begin." Evelyn's heels clicked against the polished floor of the empty classroom, the sound echoing in the silence. Charles walked beside her, his posture taut, his every movement deliberate. The air between them was charged, a silent understanding that they were about to step into uncharted territory. James Anderson sat at one of the desks, his back to them, seemingly absorbed in a stack of papers. But Evelyn knew better. His immunity to her time-stutter device made him dangerous, and she intended to uncover why. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. James didn't flinch, didn't even turn around. Too calm, she thought.
"He's expecting this."
"Dr. Hart," he replied, finally swiveling in his chair to face them. His blue eyes glinted with something unreadable, his smirk too confident for someone cornered. "And Mr. Winters, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Charles stepped forward, his voice low and authoritative. "Cut the act, James. We know you're immune to Evelyn's device. What's your play here?" James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "My play," he repeated, his tone mocking. "I could ask you the same thing. You two think you're untouchable, don't you? Playing gods with time, bending the world to your whims. But here's the thing, I don't like being manipulated." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a sly smile.
"He's not lying," she realized.
There was a sharp edge to his words, a simmering anger beneath the surface. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice a low purr. For a moment, James's smirk faltered, his gaze flickering to her, then to Charles. "I'm here to level the playing field," he said finally. "You're not the only ones with secrets, Dr. Hart, and I intend to expose them." Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Anderson." "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of danger," James shot back, his voice steady. He stood then, his movements fluid, his presence suddenly larger, more imposing. "You think you're in control, but you're not. Not anymore." Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine, a mix of unease and excitement. "He's bluffing," she told herself. "He has to be." But there was something in his eyes, something that made her doubt. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "If you're so confident," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "then prove it." James's smirk returned, sharper now, more predatory. "Oh, I intend to." Before she could react, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her, a sudden heat that she couldn't ignore. "What the hell?" she thought, her mind racing. "Is he?" "Evelyn," Charles's voice cut through the tension, sharp and urgent. "Step back." But she didn't. Couldn't. There was something magnetic about James, something that drew her in, despite the danger. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. James leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "Testing the waters," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "You're not the only one who can play with fire, Dr. Hart." Her heart was pounding now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel Charles's presence behind her, his tension palpable, but she didn't break eye contact with James. "This is a game," she reminded herself. "And I'm not losing." "Careful, James," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You're treading on thin ice." He chuckled, a low, dark sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then let's see who falls through first." And then, without warning, he kissed her. It was rough, demanding, a claiming that left no room for resistance. Evelyn's mind went blank, her body responding before she could think, her hands gripping his shoulders as she kissed him back with equal fervor. There was no time for logic, no room for doubt. Just heat, raw and unrelenting. Charles's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. "Evelyn, step back." Now. But she wouldn't. This was uncharted territory, and she was determined to explore it. She broke the kiss, her eyes locking with James's, a challenge in her gaze. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her voice husky. "I hope you're ready for the consequences." James's smirk was back, but there was a new edge to it now, a glint of something more. "Bring it on." Charles stepped forward then, his hand gripping Evelyn's arm, pulling her back. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. "This isn't a game anymore." But Evelyn wasn't so sure. There was something exhilarating about the way James looked at her, like he was seeing her in a way no one else had before. "He's dangerous," she thought. "But maybe that's exactly what I need." She turned to Charles, her lips curving into a slow, knowing smile. "You're right," she said, her voice low. "It's not a game. It's war. And I intend to win." James leaned back against the edge of Evelyn's desk, his arms crossed, that infuriating smirk plastered across his face. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with a tension that made Evelyn's skin prickle. Charles stood beside her, his jaw tight, his body radiating a quiet, controlled fury. Evelyn, however, couldn't tear her eyes away from James. There was something about him, something dangerous, that both thrilled and unsettled her. "You're playing a dangerous game," Charles said, his voice low and measured. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." James laughed, a low, amused sound that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. "Oh, I think I do," he replied, his eyes locking with Evelyn's. "In fact, I think I might know more than you do." Evelyn's brow furrowed, her instincts screaming at her. What is he hiding? She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. "What are you talking about, James?" He tilted his head, his smirk widening. "You're not the only one who's been playing with time, Dr. Hart." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze, her mind racing. What does he mean? She glanced at Charles, who looked equally stunned. "Explain," she demanded, her voice sharp. James pushed off the desk, taking a step toward her. "You thought you were the only one with the power to manipulate time? That's cute." He chuckled, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "I've been doing it for years. Your little device? Child's play compared to what I've got." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat.
Impossible.
She had spent years perfecting her time-stutter device. The idea that someone else had been meddling with time, that someone else had been watching, sent a cold wave of dread through her. Charles stepped forward, his voice like steel. "Prove it." James's smirk didn't waver. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, nothing like Evelyn's, but unmistakably a piece of advanced technology. He pressed a button and the room shifted. The air seemed to bend around them, the lights flickering, the world slowing to a crawl. Evelyn's heart raced as she realized what was happening. He's freezing time. She looked around, her mind reeling. Charles was frozen mid-step, his expression locked in a glare. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. The only sound was the steady, unnerving rhythm of James's breathing. "Impressed?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She forced herself to stay calm, to think. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. James shrugged, tucking the device back into his pocket. "Long enough. I've been watching you, Evelyn. You're fascinating." He took another step toward her, closing the distance between them. "But you've been careless, leaving trails, making mistakes. I could have exposed you 100 times over." Her eyes narrowed. "And why didn't you?" His grin widened, his gaze darkening. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go, how much you'd risk. And now I think you're ready." "Ready for what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. She didn't pull away, her body betraying her with a shiver of anticipation. "Ready to play with me," he murmured, his lips dangerously close to hers. "Ready to see what happens when two people who can control time collide." Evelyn's breath hitched. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the magnetic pull of his presence. He's dangerous, her mind warned. But another part of her, a darker, more primal part, was drawn to that danger. She wanted to know what he could do, how far he could push her. Before she could respond, James stepped back, pressing a button on his device. Time snapped back into place with a sudden, disorienting jolt. Charles stumbled forward, his eyes wide with confusion. "What the hell just happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Evelyn didn't answer. She was still reeling, her mind racing. James has been manipulating time too. He's been watching me, playing with me. The thought was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. James turned to Charles, his smirk back in place. You're out of your depth, Winters. This is between me and her. He glanced at Evelyn, his eyes gleaming with challenge. Isn't that right? Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flickering between James and Charles. She could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the choices she was about to make. What do I want? The answer came to her unbidden, a whisper in the back of her mind. I want to see how far I can go. She took a step toward James, her chin lifted in defiance. You're right, she said, her voice steady. This is between us. Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Evelyn, don't, he said, his voice low. You're playing with fire. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Maybe I want to burn. James chuckled, his eyes never leaving hers. That's what I like about you, Evelyn. You're not afraid to take risks. She felt a thrill of excitement and fear rush through her. This is it. The point of no return. She reached out, her fingers brushing against James's hand. His skin was warm, his touch electric. Show me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. His grin widened, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. Oh, I will, he murmured. But be careful what you wish for. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air crackling with anticipation. Evelyn could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the sense that she was standing on the edge of something enormous, something that would change everything. And she was ready to leap. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stepped out of James's apartment, the cool night air sharp against her flushed cheeks. She clutched her bag tightly, the weight of the advanced device James had handed her still burning in her palm. This changes everything, she thought, her mind racing. She needed to see Charles.
Now.
The drive to his penthouse was a blur, her thoughts churning with a mix of exhilaration and dread. James had shown her a version of her own invention that was beyond anything she'd imagined. It wasn't just about freezing time anymore, it was about bending it, reshaping it to their will. And James, he'd made it clear he wanted her to join him in exploring its potential. But Evelyn wasn't naive. She knew there was more to his offer than shared scientific curiosity. The way his eyes had lingered on her, the way his voice had dropped to a husky whisper, it had been a challenge, a dare. And I took it, she thought, biting her lip. She didn't call ahead. She didn't need to. Charles would be awake. He always was at this hour. When she arrived, she buzzed up, her voice calm but edged with urgency.
Charles.
It's me. The elevator ride felt interminable, her reflection in the mirrored walls betraying the tension in her posture. When the door slid open, Charles was already waiting, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, assessing. Evelyn. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the polished floors. We need to talk. He closed the door behind her, his movements deliberate. You're here, so talk. She took a deep breath, her green eyes locking onto his. James is more dangerous than we thought. His device, it's not just a time-stutter. It's something else entirely. Something powerful. Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He's immune, like me, Evelyn continued, pacing the room. But it's more than that. He's been experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with time manipulation. And he wants me to join him. Charles's eyes darkened, his voice low and controlled. And what did you tell him? She stopped, turning to face him. I told him I'd think about it. But Charles, this isn't just about science anymore. He's playing a game, a dangerous one. And if we're not careful, he'll win. Charles took a step closer, his gaze intense. Then we need to play smarter. What's his endgame? What does he want? Evelyn hesitated, her pulse quickening. Power, control, and me. The air between them crackled with tension, the unspoken weight of her words hanging heavy. Charles's eyes narrowed, his voice a low growl. Over my dead body. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Then help me stop him. We need to know everything he's planning, every move he's making. Charles's hands clenched at his sides, his frustration palpable. And how do you suggest we do that? Evelyn's lips curved into a sly smirk, her green eyes glinting with determination. We get inside his head. We play his game, but on our terms. Charles studied her for a moment, his gaze searching. Then, slowly, his expression softened. a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're dangerous, Evelyn." She stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "Only when I need to be." For a moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick, electric. Then Charles reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm.
All right.
"We'll do it your way. But we need a plan." Evelyn nodded, her mind already racing. "First, we need to find out where he's keeping his research. If we can access his data, we can stay one step ahead." Charles's brow furrowed. "And how do you propose we get it? Just waltz into his apartment and ask nicely?" Evelyn's smirk widened. "Not exactly." She reached into her bag and pulled out the device James had given her. "This is our ticket in." Charles's eyes widened as he recognized the design. "That's a modified version of my time-stutter," she confirmed. "But James has taken it to a whole new level. He can freeze time for longer periods, even manipulate it in ways I hadn't even considered." But she paused, her eyes meeting his. "He doesn't know I've already figured out how to reverse engineer it." Charles's lips curved into a slow, appreciative smile. "You never cease to amaze me." She handed him the device, her fingers brushing against his. "We'll need to move fast. If James suspects we're onto him, he'll tighten his defenses." Charles's grip on the device tightened, his resolve hardening. "Then let's not give him the chance." They spent the next few hours poring over the device, Evelyn's fingers flying across the keyboard as she worked to decrypt its code. Charles watched her, his admiration growing with every passing moment. She was a force of nature, her mind a whirlwind of brilliance and determination. "And she's mine," he thought, the possessive thought surprising him. Finally, Evelyn leaned back, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "Got it." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Got what?" She turned the screen toward him, a smug smile on her lips. "Access to James's private server. Every piece of data, every experiment, it's all here." Charles's eyes widened as he scanned the information. "This is incredible." Evelyn nodded, her expression serious. "But it's also dangerous. If James finds out we have this, he'll come after us," Charles finished, his jaw tightening. "Then we need to be ready." Evelyn stood, her movements graceful but deliberate. "We'll need to confront him, on our terms. We'll use his own game against him." Charles followed her lead, his mind racing. "And what happens then?" She turned to him, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll find out who's really in control." The air between them was thick with anticipation, the weight of their plan pressing down on them. Charles reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "Whatever happens, we do this together." Evelyn's lips curved into a sly smile. "Together." They moved to the door, the tension between them palpable. As they stepped into the hallway, Evelyn glanced at him, her voice low and teasing. "You know, Charles, you're pretty dangerous yourself." He smirked, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Only when I'm with you." Their laughter echoed down the empty hallway, but beneath it, there was a quiet understanding. This was more than just a game now, it was a battle. And neither of them planned to lose. As they reached the elevator, Evelyn pressed the button, her mind already racing ahead. "You ready?" Charles's hand settled on the small of her back, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "Ready as I'll ever be." The door slid open, and they stepped inside, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. As the elevator descended, Evelyn turned to him, her voice a whisper. "Whatever happens next, remember this. We're in this together." Charles's eyes locked onto hers, his voice low and steady. "Always." The elevator came to a stop and they stepped out into the night, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Evelyn took a deep breath, her pulse quickening. "Let's go." Charles fell into step beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Where to?" She glanced at him, a sly smile playing on her lips. "To the edge and beyond." As they walked into the night, the weight of their mission hung heavy between them, but so did the unspoken promise of what lay ahead. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. But as they turned the corner, Evelyn's breath caught. Standing in the shadows, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face, was James. "Going somewhere?" he drawled, his voice smooth and mocking. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as James stepped into the dim light of the street lamp, his smirk widening. His presence was a stark reminder of the stakes they were playing for. Charles tensed beside her, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. "James," Evelyn said smoothly, her voice betraying none of the unease she felt. Fancy meeting you here. James chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. I could say the same. You two seem awfully busy tonight. His eyes flicked to the device in Evelyn's hand. Care to share? Charles stepped forward, his voice firm. We're done playing games, James. It's time you answer for what you've done. James raised an eyebrow, his smirk never wavering. Answer for what, exactly? I'm just a substitute teacher with a keen interest in physics. His gaze lingered on Evelyn, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Evelyn tightened her grip on the device, her mind racing. This was their chance. They had the upper hand now that they'd reverse-engineered his technology. If they could just get him to fall into their trap. Let's make a deal, she purred, stepping closer to James. She could feel Charles's eyes on her, but she didn't falter. You've got something we want, and we've got something you want. Why not cut the theatrics and work together? James's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. And what exactly do you think I want, Dr. Hart? Evelyn tilted her head, her lips curving into a sly smile. Power.
Control.
The same things I want. But you're playing a dangerous game, James. One wrong move, and you could lose everything. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Then he laughed, the sound sharp and unamused. You think you can outmaneuver me? I've been playing this game longer than you have. Maybe, Evelyn conceded, her voice dripping with honey. But you've never played against someone like me. James took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. Is that a challenge? It's a trap, she thought, but she kept her expression neutral. Call it whatever you like. Charles stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the tension.
Enough.
James, this ends tonight. You're coming with us. James's smirk returned, and he spread his arms wide. By all means, take me. I'd love to see how this plays out. Evelyn glanced at Charles, and he gave her a barely perceptible nod.
Now.
She activated the device, the air around them shimmering as time slowed to a crawl. James froze mid-smirk, his expression locked in place. It worked, Charles muttered, his voice tinged with relief. Evelyn nodded, her eyes fixed on James. For now. But we need to move fast. If he's immune, this won't hold him for long. Charles stepped closer to James, his expression hard. What's the plan? Evelyn's lips curved into a predatory smile. We trap him in a time loop. He'll be stuck reliving the same moment over and over, unable to break free. Charles raised an eyebrow. And if it backfires? Then we'll deal with it, Evelyn said, her voice steady. But we can't let him keep control. Not after everything he's done. Charles nodded, his jaw clenched. Do it. Evelyn adjusted the device, her fingers moving with precision. This had to work. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The air around them seemed to hum with energy as she activated the loop, the world around James distorting as he was pulled into the endless cycle. She watched as James's frozen form flickered, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to anger. He was aware. That was the key. He'd know he was trapped, but he'd be powerless to stop it. Is it working? Charles asked, his voice low. Evelyn nodded, her gaze never leaving James. For now. But we need to monitor him. If he finds a way to break free. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences would be catastrophic. Charles stepped closer to Evelyn, his hand brushing hers. We'll handle it. Together. She looked up at him, the intensity in his eyes matching her own. In that moment, she realized just how much she'd come to rely on him. He was her equal, her partner in this dangerous game. But before she could respond, James's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and mocking. Did you really think that would work? Evelyn's blood ran cold as James stepped forward, his movements fluid despite the time loop. He'd broken free. Charles tensed, his body shifting into a defensive stance. How? James's smirk returned, and he flicked his wrist, revealing a device identical to Evelyn's. You're not the only ones with tricks up your sleeves. Evelyn's mind raced. He'd anticipated this. He'd been one step ahead all along. This changes nothing, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. You're outnumbered. James chuckled, the sound dark and menacing. Outnumbered, maybe, but not outmatched. He activated his device, the air around them shimmering as time stuttered again. Evelyn felt her body freeze, her movements slowed to a crawl. He'd turned the tables. James approached her, his gaze locked on hers. You really should have thought this through, Dr. Hart. But don't worry, I'll make sure you enjoy the consequences. Charles strained against the time freeze, his voice barely audible. Evelyn, don't let him. James turned to Charles, his smirk widening. Don't worry about her. She's in good hands. Evelyn's mind raced as James leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. You're going to regret ever crossing me. And then, everything went black. Evelyn blinked, her vision swimming back into focus. She was still frozen in place, but her mind was a whirlwind of panic and calculation. James's smug face loomed inches from hers, his blue eyes glinting with malice. Behind him, Charles was struggling against the invisible bonds of time, his jaw clenched in silent fury. Good to see you're awake, James purred, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. I was starting to think you'd sleep through all the fun. Evelyn's lips curled into a sneer, though she couldn't move a muscle. Fun? You call this fun? You're a cliché, James, a second-rate villain with a god complex. James chuckled, a low, dangerous sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Oh, Evelyn, you wound me. But don't worry, I'll make sure you're properly entertained. He stepped back, holding up a sleek, black device that looked eerily similar to her own time-stutter tool, but with more advanced modifications. You thought you were the only one who could bend time to your will? How quaint. This little beauty lets me do so much more. Want to see? Evelyn's heart pounded as he pressed a button on the device. Suddenly, the room around her shifted, the walls blurring and distorting as if reality itself were bending. She felt a strange, pulling sensation, as though she were being dragged through a tunnel of light and shadow. When it stopped, she was no longer in the school's dimly lit hallway. Instead, she stood in a lavish bedroom, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and something darker, danger. James stood in front of her, his smirk widening as he pocketed the device. Welcome to my domain, Dr. Hart. I figured we'd have a little more privacy here. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape or a weapon. But the only exit was the heavy wooden door behind James, and there was nothing within reach she could use against him. She forced herself to stay calm, her voice steady. What do you want, James? If you think for 1 second I'll let you. Let me, he interrupted, his laughter cutting through the air like a knife. Oh, Evelyn, you're in no position to let me do anything. But don't worry. I won't hurt you.
Not yet, anyway.
I just want to talk. She narrowed her eyes. Talk. You freeze me in time, drag me to your lair, and expect me to believe you just want to talk. James shrugged, his fingers trailing lazily along the edge of a nearby table. Call it what you want. I'm offering you a choice. Join me, and together we'll push the boundaries of what's possible.
Think of it, Evelyn.
With our combined knowledge, we could rule time itself. Evelyn's stomach churned at the thought. She'd always been driven by curiosity, by the desire to explore the unknown, but this was something else entirely. You're insane, she said, her voice low. I'll never help you. James's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something darker. Anger, perhaps, or desperation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, his mask of confidence slipping back into place.
Pity.
I was hoping you'd see things my way. But if you insist on being difficult. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. Evelyn flinched, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. She hated how her body responded, how even now, trapped and helpless, part of her was drawn to him. You're playing a dangerous game, James, she warned, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Charles will find us. And when he does… Charles? James laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. Your precious school board president? He's nothing, Evelyn. A pawn in a game he doesn't even understand. But you're different. You see the bigger picture. You're the queen, and I'm the king. Together, we could be unstoppable. Evelyn's breath hitched as his fingers traced a line down her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle, yet filled with menace. She wanted to pull away, to scream, to fight, but she couldn't move an inch. She was trapped, both physically and mentally, caught in a web of her own making. You're wrong, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not your queen. I'm not anything to you. James's eyes darkened, his grip on her chin tightening. We'll see about that, he murmured, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was anything but tender. It was a claim, A declaration of ownership, and Evelyn hated how her body responded, how her heart raced and her skin burned beneath his touch. When he finally pulled away, his smirk was back in full force. "You can fight me all you want, Evelyn, but we both know how this ends. You're mine. You've always been mine." Evelyn's throat tightened, her mind racing for a way out. She couldn't let him win, couldn't let him break her. But as she met his gaze, she saw something in his eyes that stopped her cold: vulnerability. For all his bravado, for all his threats and manipulations, James was just as trapped as she was, caught in a game neither of them could escape. She took a deep breath, her voice steady once more. "You're wrong, James. This isn't about ownership or control. It's about survival. And I don't intend to lose." James's smirk faltered again, his grip on her chin loosening. For a moment, she thought she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold, calculating stare she'd come to know too well. "We'll see, Evelyn," he said softly, his voice a promise and a threat all at once. "We'll see." And as he stepped back, the room around them began to blur once more, the walls and furniture dissolving into a haze of light and shadow. Evelyn's heart raced as she felt the familiar pull of the time device, the world shifting around her in a dizzying whirl of color and sound. When it stopped, she was no longer in the bedroom. She stood in a dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. James was nowhere to be seen, but the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was, or what James had planned, but one thing was certain: the game wasn't over. Not yet. And as the footsteps drew closer, she braced herself for whatever came next.